Okay, let's get started. Are we good? Okay. Information and journalist targets. My name is Gypsy Guillen Kaiser, and I'm the Director of Advocacy and Communications at the Committee to Protect Journalists. CPJ is an independent nonprofit organization that was founded 40 years ago to champion press freedom worldwide. We have, over the 40 years, measured the state of press freedom in countries around the world with rigorous research based on journalistic standards. It's an organization started by journalists for journalists, and our daily reporting, analysis, and data includes those attacked physically, legally, or digitally, those who are imprisoned or even killed in relation to their work. I'm very pleased to be joined today by two extraordinary women who are leaders in their field. To my direct left is Patricia Campos Mello. Patricia is a reporter at large and columnist at Folha de Sao Paulo newspaper, which is a major daily in Brazil. For over 25 years, she has been covering international relations, economics, and human rights, and has reported from over 50 countries, including war zones. Her reporting has been honored with numerous awards, including my organization's 2019 International Press Freedom Award, and in 2020, she received the Columbia University Maria Moores Cabot Award, among others. Since 2014, Patricia has been publishing a series of stories about the illegal use of WhatsApp mass messaging to send fake news and other influence operations to manipulate public opinion. In 2020, she published a book titled The Hate Machine, Notes from a Reporter on Fake News and Digital Violence. Further to my left is Meera Selva. Meera is the director of the Journalism Fellowship Program at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. She's also deputy director at the Reuters Institute. Meera's experience spans Europe, Asia, and Africa, with various outlets of different sorts, actually. Handelsblad Global, the Associated Press, and The Independent. She is co-founder of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, and as we know, there are many conspiracy theories around climate. And her work at the Reuters Institute includes this topic area, as well as newsroom diversity and media freedom. We also congratulate Meera on her recent appointment as the new CEO of Internews Europe. So that is our panel today. And to start with this topic, I wanted to really go to the heart of the issue here and why we need to discuss it. Essentially, political narratives are no longer limited to electoral campaigns. They're an ongoing barrage of information, disinformation, and trolling as part of that. A lot of this takes place online. Some of it transcends the virtual space. And essentially, by discrediting, dehumanizing, and publicly vilifying journalists, those engaged in these actions don't just control the narratives, right? The point is to intimidate, to silence, to feed animosity and intolerance towards the press, which opens the door to physical attacks and legal harassment. It also affects trust in the media, which is at an all-time low. I'm going to go quickly through a few sobering facts, a bit of data. One is that 70% of the world's population now live in dictatorships, according to Sweden's V-Dem Institute. That's on their latest report on global democracy. According to the same report, a record 35 states suffer from significant deteriorations in freedom of expression at the hands of governments. 10 years ago, it was only 5. Polarization has reached unprecedented levels. And in the 2019 Global Disinformation Order Report, we see that 47 countries used trolling as part of their digital arsenal to attack political opponents, activists, and journalists via social media. That's a very sobering statistic. Now, we know that the term trolling is sort of thrown around quite a bit, and we all use it very lightly when somebody's pestering us on social media. But it's really important that it be understood in a different way so as not to minimize or normalize the issue. So let's start here, and I'm going to pose the question to both of you. Who are these trolls? How do they operate? What are we talking about here? Who finances them? And what's been your experience and your knowledge?
Well, I think there's kind of trolling on several levels. And on one level, there is the kind of organized, institutional creation of bots and networks that aren't real people, or they aren't real people saying the things that they really feel. They are paid or incentivized in other ways to go and create trouble on social media. And they are paid or incentivized often by government authorities, often by malicious actors, often by one side of a particularly polarized, toxic debate. Then you have people who do have opinions, who are people, who do see that part of their role in public life is to make their views known, and make their views known in a very damaging, critical, toxic way. And then there are people who get caught up in the maelstrom, who end up accidentally falling into a debate and getting caught up in the moment in a way, and possibly posting online in a way that they will later come to regret, but in that time is doing huge damage. So I think there's three levels of what we call trolling. I think the first two are the kind of the most dangerous and the ones that are really destroying public debate online, and is doing a great deal of harm to the safety of journalists as well.
I think it's always a combination of organic movements, like real people who actually believe in disinformation and start to amplify attacks, and bots or state-coordinated attacks. I always think it's useful to give examples. They might be a bit graphic, but I'll give you an example. For instance, some time ago I interviewed the US ambassador in Brazil about 5G and China, right? This is like my daily job. I cover foreign policy besides disinformation. So the ambassador goes there and he tweets the interview and he tags me. He usually gets like 30 comments maximum per tweet. In 30 minutes, he has over 350 comments saying things like, "Oh, ambassador, please use 2 condoms. She's a whore. Ambassador, she likes anal sex." That kind of stuff. So what's the effect of that? This is a source, right? I mean, it's part of my job. I need to speak to him to get my job done. So that way, there's both sides. On the one hand, they are intimidating me, because I'm thinking, okay, so every time I post a story, I mean, I don't post opinions ever, but I post stories or tweet stories, there's going to be stuff like that. Or my sources are going to be, so who's this reporter that people are calling, So this is bots. I think that's mostly bots, right? And then there's the state-stimulated stuff. Give you another example. A month ago, one of President Bolsonaro's sons posted on Instagram and Twitter a column I had written in 2014 about the rapprochement between Cuba and the US, calling me amplified everywhere. That's on Telegram, WhatsApp, and everywhere. And then I start getting those messages, like horrible messages and threatening messages, because it's like it's a green light. And I'm sure lots of people are like real people, but they just think they're just expressing their opinions by sending messages saying you should die because you're a communist.
So what I'm hearing here is that there is a level that's an operation, right? A proper operation that then sort of seeps into the general public piling on and playing a part in this. Can you talk a little bit about the role of other journalists in this context? Other journalists piling on to some degree, or helping to detract some attention from this very toxic dynamic? And also, Patricia, if you can talk a bit about the WhatsApp, the way in which WhatsApp is used, and in which is something that you probed back in 2018. And just so that people understand what kind of operation this is. WhatsApp is obviously pervasive, used just very heavily, particularly in countries outside of the United States and less so in Europe, but I think Latin America and Asia are very heavy on WhatsApp. But anyway, Meera, I know you have a bit to say about the piling on bit.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of trolling that we're talking about is designed to silence criticism. This is the kind of aim of it, and to discredit people who are speaking uncomfortable truths or representing certain sections of the population that we would rather not, some people would rather not see in public. So it is designed to silence and suppress. Journalists overall are operating increasingly in kind of polarized societies. It's always been a competitive profession. It's always been a profession where you try to scoop your opponents, you try to get one up on them. I'm a journalist myself, we're used to competing. What concerns me, and a lot of the research I did on kind of press freedom in Central and East Europe, is the feeling that this kind of healthy competition has, in certain environments, tipped into destruction, where it's very tempting to join in the pile-on of journalists from other publications, especially ones who are very different to your own, because it's an easy win to discredit your opponent like this. But what ultimately all of journalism will be destroyed if journalists kind of encourage this kind of pile-on against each other. That's not to say there shouldn't be a kind of healthy critical look at our industry. That's absolutely vital. But I think all journalists do also need to be aware that there needs to be some sense of solidarity amongst each other, so that when some journalists do come into this kind of very vicious trolling, the others at
responsibility of not being part of the organized bit seeping into
just
the
being
general
aware
public.
if they're being played and manipulated by other forces.
Great, carried out is
Sure.
a very good example.
Okay. So over 99% of smartphones in Brazil, many phone companies, they offer 0 rating for WhatsApp. That means that you do not spend your data package using WhatsApp. So people just use WhatsApp, right? Okay. So in 2018, what several journalists were investigating, the humongous amount of disinformation circulating over WhatsApp, right?
And this was electoral.
Electoral, all electoral. I mean, there's the classic electoral disinformation, voting machine is rigged, or they get a voting roll from Japan and say it's in Brazil. And then there's the targeted disinformation towards candidates and information, etc. So back then I did a series of stories showing that there was automation involved. They had a scheme that several people were using WhatsApp emulators in troll forms to send massive amounts of messages into public WhatsApp groups. And that's how they managed to reach so many people so fast with the narratives they were trying, right? And then, they were using people's data, because you could basically choose, okay, so what's the type of audience I want to target? I want to target voters in the urban zone that are middle-aged and women, because they were also buying people's data from, illegal sources, right? So, there's several developments to the story, but basically this was it. And part of it was being paid by businessmen, so that violates electoral legislation. So WhatsApp has become, it's the main way to spread a narrative and keep people in a parallel news ecosystem. Right now in Brazil, Telegram and WhatsApp have this role, because these messaging apps, they use them to, one, discredit critical journalists, investigative journalists. So they're all the time saying, in my personal case, porn videos, porn messages, porn montages, pictures, and all that stuff, or saying people are communist, and discrediting traditional media. In that sense, the Rede Globo is the main TV, so that keeps people just getting their information from these WhatsApp groups or from extreme right-wing bloggers, YouTubers, and the role of the messaging apps is that everything is cross-platform. So
right, there's the screenshots from the created virality that's been clearly paid for and automated, then seeps into the general public who then start participating in some way. This goes back to the 3 layers that Meera explained. And then we end up with this toxic environment, which also contains a misogynistic element. And there's well-known research from UNESCO and the International Center for Journalists, which found that 73% of women journalists surveyed across 125 countries reported having faced online violence doing their job. So you've been targeted in this way. Why is this happening, this instrumentalizing of someone's sex and sexualizing the journalist's role, which is breaking up this narrative and fake virality?
It starts off with who has a right to be in the public space, in the public domain. And there is deep-rooted misogyny in several sections of society, and it has been allowed to manifest in the digital space in ways that don't exist in the physical space because there are laws against it. There are laws against harassment and abuse and violence in real life. But I think the kind of law has been slow to catch up digitally, and then the companies, the products themselves have been slow to accept the misogyny that exists on their platform, so they haven't had the tools to restrain this misogyny in the way they have been able to in real life, not always, but in more cases. So I think this is part of it. I think it's then, again, it's an easy tool to attack someone with. So when you have a journalist and you look at what they're if they're a woman, there's an immediate whole range of rape threats, sexual allegations, all things you can just throw immediately. They're kind of pulled out of the cupboard in a way. And what we find actually is that men do get attacked online as well. I mean, a lot of research shows that men, posting political comments do come under huge attack as well, but the attacks are different. They're not as personalized. So the attacks that women face are kind of targeted, personalized, often sexualized, often threatening physical and sexual violence. The attacks against men are a bit more like, you're an idiot, but not quite as personal.
Right. And Patricia, in your case, receiving these things, obviously this is very hurtful, this is professionally difficult. I mean, how do you approach this vilification of 2 condoms?
Right.
And,
adding to what Meera said, of course, journalists, male journalists are also targeted, but women, it's always like, they're never going to say, your story sucks, it's garbage, or it's wrong, which is absolutely fair, and if it's wrong, we're going to correct, and you may sue me, that's all right. No, they're going to say either, you're fat, you're ugly, you're old, you're offering sex, you're a whore, your husband is corrupt, they're going to threaten your son. It's never about the work you're doing, right? So how I deal with this, and the sexualized aspect, I think there's 2 things. It's very effective in mobilizing the base, the most radicalized base. So in
let's
that sense,
talk about that, the extremist part of the political spectrum and how useful this is.
As you were saying, and Meera as well, I mean, minorities are the main targets, and in my case and other journalists, this happens to like almost every journalist, women journalists in Brazil, just to make sure it's not just me, right? It's very easy to portray, oh, she's a woman, she's sort of independent, she does her thing, she investigates, she must be having sex with someone. That's like the oldest, insult ever. And that way you mobilize your base, and on the other hand, it's a smokescreen. also going to give you an example real quick. In 2020, there was a militia member with links to the government that was assassinated, right, with 7 cell phones that were not recovered up until today. A few days after that, the president himself and his sons and his allies, they launched 2 online attacks against me, saying basically that I was offering sex in exchange for information, damaging information against him. And this is done in several platforms, on live TV, Congress floor, and against a very well-known doctor saying that he had embraced a transgender detainee that had committed a crime. Out of the blue. So it's a smokescreen. It's very effective because all of a sudden, no one's talking about the militia guy. They're talking about the whatever journalist, whatever doctor, right?
Yeah.
And how do I react? I don't. We have a say in Brazil, I'm not sure if it's going to translate well, is that we don't clap for crazy people to dance. Like, I'm not going to engage. I don't answer at all, ever. I've never done.
Right. So essentially, there's a distraction with scandal in order to deflect from the facts, which is the traditional role of traditional media, so to speak. And in terms of the reaction, I mean, I think it's very clear what the damage is to society, right? Once this is the dominant narrative, it's clear you can't have a serious discussion about the political future of a country. But in terms of the reaction, I mean, is there counter-mobilization that you have seen work?
I think there's 2 strategies, which is either Patricia's, which is not engage, maintain a public presence on social media. You have over 200,000 followers, I think, so you're still very
226,000.
There you go. So you're still very present, but you're absolutely right. It's a completely sensible strategy to say, I won't engage. The other strategy is to publicly call out the trolls, which I've seen more and more journalists do. It's a high energy strategy. It takes up a lot of time, a lot of emotion, again, drags you into another fight and into other fights. And it's like, how much time do you want to spend? Snowballing. I think on a kind of more institutional level, I think newsrooms need to be aware that their reporters face this threat, and they need to have structures in place and procedures in place to make sure that the journalists feel supported and know what to do. I think the platform companies themselves need to look at this, and there are various things being trialed and, various options being discussed. But I think it needs to be recognized as a problem, recognized that it's targeted at certain people, so not everyone has the same experience on social media. So it's no point saying, well, I've never noticed this, so it can't be a problem. We've got to realize that women experience it differently, minorities experience it differently, people outside English-speaking countries. So I think there needs to be a recognition, and then there needs to be support for the journalists who face this, and then there need to be kind of interventions by platforms, and then there need to be some kind of legal actions taken against this as well, because these are 2 things. Firstly, they're often threats. They're often threats of violence, which are illegal, and the online threats very frequently will result in real-life harm. So it's not enough to just say it's an online problem, because it translates into real-world danger very quickly.
Right. Patricia, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think public pressure is the main weapon you have. This is the only way either politicians or internet platforms respond. In our case, Brazilian journalists, women, just like the solidarity among women and the way they were speaking out and saying, this is the stuff that is going on, and, putting pressure on Twitter, on Facebook, and say, you have to do something, right? And only when they feel that this is going to damage their brand, they start doing something. Otherwise, they're going to say, freedom of speech, which is important, right? But not to, threaten people.
Right. There was a significant development yesterday where the New York Times editor-in-chief, Dean Baquet, issued a series of memos, and some other editors at the paper issued a series of memos, essentially telling their journalists that there's no need to be constantly on Twitter, that the platform warps their understanding of who their audience is. and that it's a major driver of harassment and abuse. This was coupled with an announcement of an expansion of the team protecting journalists from online abuse and further investments in digital security. So I do want to ask you in relation to this part about sort of the bubble that Twitter specifically is, because let's be clear, I mean, journalists are very, very present on Twitter. It's a very fast platform. It's a very news-driven platform. Let's talk a little bit about this dynamic of the need or the pressure to promote one's work. And what's the link to these virtual lynchings, sort of the dynamic there, and what role does that play? Is there a link? And how do you view that? How do you balance that, right? The actual, the engagement with this bubble that can be very toxic. And I know you have a very specific way of handling this where you don't really engage, but it can get very personal very quickly, even between journalists. So it'd be great to hear your take on that part of it.
I think journalists love Twitter with good reason. It's kind of like a personalized newswire that's fun and engaging and gets you the news in ways, much quicker than anything else. So it's a terrific platform when it works. I think it's interesting, it's the New York Times saying we don't need our journalists to be on Twitter necessarily, or they're basically taking away a perceived idea that it's part of your job to be on Twitter. That's what they're kind of expressly saying. Firstly, we don't want you to waste time on it, but also if we've given the impression that it's part of what you're meant to do for us, we're kind of expressly saying it's not. That's fine when you're the New York Times and you have that kind of brand and that reach and a business model that works and you're wealthy, and so you've got other ways of promoting your journalism. A lot of news outlets rely on social media and rely on their journalists being on social media much more for brand distribution, so that's part of it. The other part is the gatekeeping role. So young journalists, especially, I know, who have often taken to social media, to TikTok, to put out the kind of stories and the kind of journalism, or even frame the stories in ways that they think their audiences will understand, that their employers have not necessarily agreed with. Sophie Smith-Gaylor, who used to work at the BBC, is now at Vice, built up a TikTok presence that was very independent of the BBC, because she decided that she knew how to tell these stories differently. She was very successful and very good at it. It's not what the BBC wanted her to do. So there is this element of how much do you want to tell journalists to be behind their news brands, because the news brands are then acting as their old-fashioned role as gatekeepers, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So that's, I think, one issue. The toxicity is also partly because the blurring of news and opinion when you post on social media. And I think a lot of the kind of conflagration is because people post things that are opinion, that are also taken as news, and it gets very blurred. And I don't really know what the solution is to that. I think that's something these organizations are struggling with generally across the board. But I think, again, if I were under attack, I would absolutely take your approach of saying, I will, from my end, just know that I fully understand that that's the deal that audience often who want to know what you believe in. They want to know who you are. They want to know what you believe in before they trust what you're saying and before they trust your reporting. So it is a difficult balance there.
I mean, it's a matter of personality, right? Like some people, they have this presence online and they want to cultivate, the audience. I think there's one important distinction, that is, if you are a reporter, it's not your job to give opinions about stuff you're covering. This is one thing that I think it's really tough. If you're a columnist or, editor, anchor, whatever, it's fine. But if you like tweeting all the time what's your position in specific issues that you are covering? I mean, of course we all have bias, we know that, but can you try, and then again, can you imagine if you spent all that time reporting instead of telling people how do you feel about stuff? So, but that's a personality thing, right? I mean, the way I engage is like, if they say a story is wrong or a story is bad, that's criticism, that's legitimate, and I say, thank you, I'm gonna check, and I'm gonna, tweet or post recordings,
You're going to back up your
spreadsheets.
story.
I'm going to back up my story, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not going to say, I don't know. But again, I don't judge. This is a personality. I wouldn't have
Right.
time. I'm not the, fighting type. I'm not going to, I understand some people do, they tweet and they tag the minister and I'm like, why would I do that?
Let me ask you this. Is the combination of the coordinated attacks and the heavy opinion dimension, and sort of a very personalized take, and then these very personalized attacks, is that creating, is that coming together and affecting trust? Trust in the individual journalist, trust in the role of journalism, trust in the established facts. If you could comment a little bit on that, I think it would be useful, because ultimately, if we go back to what I said at the beginning about vilifying, dehumanizing, and removing this element of authority of the facts, which come to the public through the journalists, if we consider that in relation to the organized attacks and the very present and dominant role of opinion online, where does that leave us in terms of trust?
Sure. I think this is a very interesting question. I think to some extent, several of these so-called digital populist leaders, they did manage to create parallel news ecosystems. Sorry, I'm giving all these Brazilian examples, but that's the ones I have.
That's your reality.
So sorry, but I'm sure it applies to so many countries. If in Brazil you have a big part of the population, I don't have quantitative research to do that, but I mean there's several polling that they do not believe in mainstream newspapers, they do not believe in mainstream TVs, they believe in social media accounts of the president and his allies, extreme right-wing bloggers, and WhatsApp.
Is there a role for religious media? Because I know there's very big religious media in
It's
Brazil.
part of the base. It's part of the base. It's also, there's a convergence, the anti-vax, religious, anti-abortion, not that is not legitimate. There's the anti-abortion crowd that is not saying that, everyone, it's not, but they get these very specific polarizing issues, and so there's this ecosystem. So if you're writing something like or a website online, say this is XYZ, and the person said, no, I got a WhatsApp yesterday from my cousin, and I really trust her. And the president said that all media are communist, so.
Right. Meera?
Yeah, it's a lot to unpick. I think it is affecting trust. I just want to go back to the one thing about the beginning when you said about, what journalists post an opinion. That's partly true, but I also don't want to get into victim blaming here, because some journalists are just going to be trolled, not because they're doing something wrong online.
Regardless.
Yes.
I mean, I remember one conference where Rana Ayub pulled out her screen and tweeted a full stop, and then just to show the instant trolling that followed her. So,
well, that's the thing. I think people get to a point where it's going to be triggered no
it's
matter
going to be
what.
triggered by,
no
it's
matter
going to be
what
triggered
they
by
do.
you existing.
Blame victims, yeah.
By
It's
your
going to be triggered
existence
you.
and your role as a journalist.
Exactly. So, and that, so it's not, so it's not so much about that journalists necessarily need to change. That's not the solution.
No.
To get,
No.
you'd be fine if only you were just quiet. It's not going to work. It's about discrediting, it's the oldest trick in the book to discredit independent journalism, to establish your own power base.
But it's really hyper.
And
in
it's
this
very
way.
hyper, yeah. It's hyper, it can be done very quickly. Again, it's who are the gatekeepers to information, so governments can now post out their own messaging on social media, they can create their own platforms, and they can message, and also people don't know where the messaging is coming from. So when it appears on your WhatsApp group, you've lost the thread of did it come from the BBC or Bolsonaro's information unit or a blogger, you just lost it. All you can see is the kind of information or an image often, often an image and without any sense of where it's actually coming from. So what we're losing is a sense of who's creating this content. Is it, are the content creators trusted? Because those are what journalists are ideally trusted content creators.
Is it helpful for journalists to be sort of contributing to an understanding and media literacy to some degree, an understanding of sourcing and all of this, and have a level of transparency in their reporting? Is that a technique? Can that backfire?
Yeah. Well, yeah, we were talking about this. So there is an important movement in journalism about transparency, which is show your workings, explain, put the documents. If you've got a leak, write the story, but also put the original sourcing up. All that is true as long as it also accords with source protection, privacy concerns, and your own personal safety, because it's a certain level of transparency.
Let's talk a little bit about some approaches to protection, to solutions, and with this really, really hard problem. And obviously, a lot of NGOs are working to influence these cropping up. I mean, there's a Twitter Safety and Security Council, which has consulted people around the world, journalists, and tried to come up with some ways. There's a button to stop people from replying who are not followers. Then Meta is going to be releasing their first ever human rights report in May, is what's expected. And so I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the platforms and what they're doing, and to what degree, in your experience, has it been helpful or not?
I think you should answer this first, because you're right on the front line of it.
Right.
Everything affects you directly.
I think it's a bit better. When all that craziness started in 2018, they were literally ignoring, that people were being harassed, and that having deepfake porn stuff, it's not freedom of speech. However, now I think, for instance, Twitter, they are more proactive, right? They are trying to do something. There's the security, the safety initiatives. However, we don't know, there's no transparency as in, how many moderators do you have for a specific language, right? How much money did you invest in AI in a specific language? Because what I see is sometimes it's just overwhelming, the amount of trolling and attacks that violate their community rules. They can't keep up. And then, since we don't know how much they spend in that.
Right, so you don't know how much they're investing in controlling something that is ultimately going to affect the amount of traffic on their platform, and also that it's very English-centric.
It's very English-centric. I mean, there is a recognition, we've come a long way, and at least there's a recognition that this is a problem, and a recognition that this is happening online, and it's organized and structural, and again, causing real-world harm. So I think that is some progress. It's very focused on the English-speaking world. I think it's, it doesn't apply. And that's, I think outside the English-speaking world, it's not so much about traffic, because I think in some countries, the traffic is relatively low, because, it's like low populations, but just not willing to put in the resources. In other places like India and Brazil, it's very high population densities. And it's a very, you need people who really understand on the ground what's going on, who understand the nuances of language, who understand the things that are going to be triggering and dog whistles. There are certain phrases that exist in all cultures that are dog whistles, and it's very hard to police those unless you have a team who are really rooted in that country. And a lot of this is absolutely to do with issues of diversity and AI and diversity in tech. Who is writing the codes? Who's writing the algorithms? Are they truly representative of the user base everywhere? Are they being fair? Are they programs that end up with the products that we have?
Yeah, and the control mechanisms to keep a degree of civility and safety on the platforms, right? Okay, that's very helpful. I know, Meera, that one of the things you recommended in a report that you wrote called Fighting Words, focused on Central and Eastern European journalists, that journalists can defend their work by focusing on value and by having the value of their work, the value of their reporting, which goes to the heart of this notion that journalism is a public good. And in a way, these platforms are such a public space, and a very dominant public space, that it makes sense for that case to be made on those platforms. So it'd be great if you could talk a little bit about that approach and how to do that in a very politicized world.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's part of a wider conversation about journalists need to advocate for themselves, which again is not something to do. It's an interesting, you don't want to become the story, but to essentially say this is who we are, and the information doesn't just fall from the sky. It is created, it is written, the stories are written, they're investigated, they're produced by people like you and me. And in Hungary, for example, which is going through a real convulsion in the media space, and a lot of independent outlets are folding, basically very, overt external government pressure. But the ones that are trying to survive are doing so by making the case to their readers, support us because this is why we are important. I mean, it's a slog, and it's dispiriting, and I don't want to say this is like a magic key, but it's almost vital that you do it, that you kind of explain to readers what good journalism is, and who you are and why you're doing it, not by giving all your personal details, but saying, this is the principled idea. And I think that's in Central and Eastern Europe, a lot of the journalists I spoke to said this is just the way they're coping with kind of this horrible pressure that's coming to bear down on them, and their ability to work is to kind of say we need to kind of come up with our own message story about ourselves and be willing to tell that story both to ourselves in particularly dark times, but also to the public.
Right. It seems that the trend towards nonprofit newsrooms has led to more newsrooms, this is not an inherent thing. Like, journalists don't want to talk about themselves and the impact of their work necessarily. They want to do the story, publish the story, and go to the next story and do the research, right? But it seems there is more of a trend of talking about the impact of the reporting, at least in the nonprofit journalism space, because impact gets them funding.
Yeah, I mean, it's possibly another panel, but there's also that question then of does impact become activism? If you're trying to measure impact, do you then start being
and does
activists?
That feed the trolls again?
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's an ongoing conversation. Patricia, I know that you took legal action. You sued President Bolsonaro and his son, I believe. And how did you come to that decision? How did you weigh the risks involved in taking such a stance for yourself and taking legal action?
Well, first, I have the privilege of having, a job and legal assistance. So I know that's not an option for everyone, even though everyone is going through this. There's some places that offer legal assistance, like in Brazil, we have the Association of Investigative Journalism, but it was really the last resort. I mean, I was publishing all concrete evidence, saying, see, this is a lie because not engaging, just, and my idea was this is going to go away, right? This is, 2 days, 3 days, that's the lifespan. Except it didn't go away, because every week the president or his son or one of his allies or a councilman in the Amazon or someone would be saying this again. And then we started discussing. I mean, I had never sued anyone. It's just, I don't think that's our job. So it got to a point that, okay, so if we don't sue, it's just going to normalize the whole thing. What's the next thing he's going to do? I mean, if he thinks he can go on live TV and say, this horrible stuff, and then his son can go on the floor, the Congress floor, and say this, and that gets repeated over and over again on podcasts, so that's why I decided to sue, and we won, but they're appealing.
So they're in the appeal process right now?
They are.
And they're also in an election process, is that correct?
They're also in the election process, yes. Yes.
And so it continues.
It's going to be interesting coverage.
Okay, very good. Well, I think we've explored a number of issues, and so any of you have comments that you'd like to close with before we open up for Q&A? No?
No.
Okay. Very good. Obviously, a very complex set of issues, but it's heartening to hear that at least there are some openings in terms of improvement of the technology, a dialogue that's ongoing, a need to diversify and to consider options given a specific context that might work, such as your decision to sue. I'm going to open up for Q&A at this point. We have no microphones to go around the audience, so what I'm going to ask is that you please identify yourself if you have a question, speak up clearly, and I will repeat the question so that it is available for the recording of this session. Please, here in the front.
Can you repeat a bit louder? Sorry.
Yes. So you stopped answering to comments.
Okay.
What was the process like that you get?
Okay, so the question,
yes.
let me just repeat the question for the purposes of the recording. Emma is asking about the process of coming to the decision to not respond. What are the considerations around that and the plus and minuses?
Well, I report. I use the official channels to report abusive behavior. If it's something that, let's say, they have the number of my bank account, things that already happened, or they're mentioning my family, or they have my address, I report to the police. But if you're in the middle of, the most horrible, like the first minutes of this kind of lynching, that's a horrible word to use, but anyway, sometimes it's good to stop looking at it. I mean, at least that's how I felt. I got a friend, it's like, just look if there's something I need to be worried that's gonna, be in real life, if people have specific data or information, and tell me. But don't, because if you keep on looking at it, it just gets toxic. You're getting intoxicated. It's like, you keep on thinking, who are these people? Like someone who sits or his computer and says that stuff, right? So I guess I don't have many, not sure if that's if that's an answer that helps, but I usually either report or stop reading.
Well, these people are the people who are automated and paid and mobilized.
But
and
some are normal
And then
people.
the second ones that are normal people who decide to join the fray, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Meera.
Yeah.
Do you want to
Okay.
add to it?
There's another question here in the front, please.
Hi, I'm Roberto, and I would like to ask you something about one important topic that you mentioned, which is fact-checking. And the Associated Press said that in a few years, it's going to be very hard to understand if a photo is real or not, since the technologies are going to improve in that manner. What are your suggestions for younger generation that approach to social media and understanding what sources are accountable for?
That's a very good question.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah. So the question is, I think the AP had said that in a few years it'll be completely impossible to tell whether a photograph is real or doctored, and what are the suggestions for the younger generation to verify what they see on social media. I think this is part of a wider media literacy campaign where we need to talk about sourcing. I would say it's possibly not only a problem that the younger generation need to face. I think a lot of older people struggle to distinguish between real and doctored images online, and and not understand the how to source check. I think if we say that a healthy information ecosystem is vital for the kind of functioning democracy, there's a big case for having more media literacy conversations at school, at university, and throughout our lives, really, because the technology changes and the threats change. So it's not something you can learn once when you're 15 and think that'll carry you through till you're 65. So in the same way that you have public education campaigns on vaccinations or on how to vote, I think we possibly need public education campaigns on how to consume media, how to trust your sources, how to check. And this needs to be done every few years because the technology changes.
Yeah. I'll actually add to that there's quite a bit of discussion going on around this, and one of the things that's actually being discussed at this festival is Adobe has an initiative that's called the Content Verification Initiative, and it's a technical solution for journalists who are taking photographs in particular. I'm not sure if it applies to video, but it's a unique timestamp and geolocation thing that allows for the verification, the contextualization of legitimate images before publication, or if you need to prove certain things post-publication, it's able to lead back to that. And then there's some nonprofits that also do work in this area. The organization called Witness, which is, they use video for advocacy, and they're US based, and there's a group that's also based in Berlin called Tactical Tech that looks at a lot of these issues. So there are ongoing efforts, and hopefully they will be effective in this regard. Okay, are there any, we have another question here in front.
I'd like to know, how do you think that institutions and platforms should face the fact that that hate speech and these kind of attacks are every time more acceptable or naturalized or actually presented as freedom of speech? Do you think that platforms and institutions should do more against that? That social acceptance.
Yeah, that's an excellent question.
Do you want to repeat the question, or I can repeat it?
If platforms and institutions should do more in terms of responding to hate speech because it's getting more normal and widespread, right?
Versus freedom of expression.
Versus freedom
versus
of-
the notion.
Even as it is freedom of expression of opinion, it's just legitimate opinion.
Right. I think it's very hard, and we don't want that they're going to be in the position of, but they are in the position of saying, okay, so this is hate speech and this is not, right? This is disinformation, this is not. We want to avoid that, but in the end, that ends up happening. So I think maybe to get this, for that it's a bit better, you need transparency. You need very transparent and updated community standards saying, okay, so what is allowed and what is not, right? And when writing this, usually platforms prefer to do universal rules. However, there's regional and country level specific dog whistles, very subtle stuff. So I think there needs to be some local knowledge, right? So that you can identify hate speech in specific country contexts. But I mean, it's more in terms of transparency and following their own rules than, because we don't want to give them that much power. I mean, that's the whole discussion, at least in Brazil and several other countries where we have bills to regulate platforms. To what extent do you want to give them this huge power of saying, this is hate speech? I don't allow it.
Yeah. And to what extent can you regulate civility, right? Which is, that's part of the reason we're having this discussion, because it's a virtual lynching that is motivated, perhaps initiated by these automated trolls and bots, but seeps into the broader population that has opinions that may or may not be legitimate, right? And so you don't want to get into a situation where aspect of it, depending on who's in power. So this is another very important element to keep in mind. There's another question here.
Hi, my name is Jacob. My question
The level of disinformation? I'm sorry, I'm going to ask the question. So how does Brazil compare to other countries in Latin America in terms of... If it's worse in other countries in terms of the volume of disinformation or... Well, I think there's several countries that are mainly... There's a type of leader, populist leader, that really benefits from this. When we are talking about, you know, the role of state in disinformation, right? So I would say Nicaragua, El Salvador, you know, Brazil, you have them using social media as a way to mold narratives, sometimes in a very efficient way. And on top of that, COVID deniers. So Brazil, maybe it's really a case study because it's a COVID denier president. So on top of all the, you know, you guys are communist thing, you had the anti-vax, COVID. So maybe, I think I would say these three countries are particularly bad in that.
Mm-hmm. But also you have a bigger population.
Yeah, that too.
I mean,
Brazil
Brazil is a very big country, so the volume is there de facto. Okay, well, we are pretty much at time. I mean, we have 2 minutes, so I did want to mention that what you just explained about certain populist leaders taking on this role of setting the tone and setting the narrative is the case currently in El Salvador, where you have an incredibly media-savvy president who's young, who's embracing cryptocurrency, who is also had to facing a very serious gang problem in the country, and has effectively, in the last 48 hours, criminalized reporting on gangs, which is probably the biggest problem that the country faces in terms of violence. There was a state of emergency declared due to some killings by the gangs. One key investigative news organization called El Faro is engaged in reporting on these gangs, and they have come to a point where now they potentially will face criminal charges for reporting on this issue. As this happened, El Faro has been targeted by bots on social media platforms. So clearly all of these things are linked, and we will continue to see how it plays out. We must, I have to make a public call because it's my duty as someone who works on press freedom and defending journalists. We must defend our right to know things, to know the truth, to have the facts. And it requires each and every one of us to make that demand in the spaces that we are in. I know this is a friendly crowd. You all came to this festival because you care and you want to learn and know, but it really requires an active defense of our right, our collective right, to know things that affect our daily lives and our ability to decide. And that's what journalism does. That is the purpose of this work. And with that, I'd like to end, unless any of you want to say anything else. Thank you so much for joining us.